Hello everyone and welcome to this panel on democracy and violence, a topic that is as broad and diverse as it is important. My name is Anton Moisenko and I'm a lecturer in law here at ANU, and I will introduce our esteemed panel in just a moment. But I suppose in terms of scene setting, we can make of this theme whatever we want, and there's no shortage of countries that are currently experiencing challenges and dilemmas in relation to tackling internal or external violence while trying to preserve their democratic features and ensure that they don't sacrifice them to the exigencies of tackling that violence and internal or external threats, be that in Ukraine, Israel. Occasionally we have seen examples of otherwise stable countries tackling outbursts of internal violence, like with the attack on the US Capitol in 2021. So, as I said, an array of examples around the world that we can delve into and discuss today, and we couldn't be joined by a better array of people to have that conversation with. So starting from my right-hand side, I'm delighted to introduce His Excellency Ambassador Vasyl Mroshnichenko, the Ambassador of Ukraine in Australia. And as a Ukrainian citizen myself, I'm particularly pleased to introduce the ambassador who's been so active in representing Ukraine here and in the region more broadly. They say that Putin has body doubles to do public events for him, and based on the number of appearances that you do, I suspect you might have a couple of those as well. But I'm sure we have the real deal here with us today.
Totally.
I'm also delighted to welcome Professor Benjamin Goldsmith from ANU. Professor Goldsmith's expertise is diverse, and it spans multiple areas in political science and international relations, ranging from the influence of public opinion on state policy to genocide and other atrocity prevention. So quite a few touch points there with our theme of democracy and violence. Then I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Suzanne Young from La Trobe University. Suzanne is a professor of management, governance, and corporate social responsibility at the La Trobe Business School, and she has also held a number of senior governance roles there. And of particular relevance to our discussion today, much of her research explores the role of corporations in society more broadly and democracy specifically. And last but not least, we've got Associate Professor Danielle Ireland-Piper from ANU's own National Security College, where she conducts research in a number of areas related to how states tackle cross-border threats. One of those topics is transnational crime that I'm hoping to touch on today, but once again, a pretty extraordinary array of relevant expertise there. So the way that we're going to run this session is I'm going to start by asking a couple of questions of our speakers. They will talk for approximately 10 minutes each, and then hopefully we'll have ample time for Q&A and interaction with the audience. I will start with the ambassador, if I may. You represent a country that is, of course, striving not only to navigate the challenges of the war itself, but also to preserve and indeed strengthen democratic institutions at home. One example of that is the fight against corruption that has accelerated by all appearances over the past couple of years. But we've also seen a lively discussion over whether Ukraine should hold elections, even in wartime. And so I was wondering if you could give us an insight into how the Ukrainian government navigates that tension between strengthening democracy and tackling an all-out war.
Thank you, Anton. It's a very comprehensive question, and I will try to give you an answer to the best of my knowledge and to the best of the and to give the best view of what's happening, what challenges we face, and where we are. Traditionally, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine trying to maintain strong democratic institutions, which was not an easy one. You know, going through a transition from communism to market economy, and also embracing democracy in itself was not an easy one, because many of the countries, because of the development of the country and the way it was going, often institutions were attacked or they were subverted. Sometimes they were affected by the weak systems, sometimes even prone to corruption. So for us, nevertheless, it's always been a distinct feature of Ukraine to maintain functional democracy, which made us so different from Russia. And a great respect for Russia to have Ukraine next door, a country which is having different political leaders running the country. And every time Ukrainians don't like their political leaders, we vote them out. People, or sometimes we could even organize demonstrations, as we've seen during the Orange Revolution in 2004, or later on during the Revolution of Dignity in 2013. And that was a freedom-loving nation which is cherishing its democratic institutions and its ability to get rid of those authoritarian leaders, or who we think might have tendency to authoritarianism or be, blatantly corrupt, and we would get rid of them. And always it's been a threat to Vladimir Putin's regime, which has been running Russia as a dictator for 23 years. And it was an existential threat for him, and that's one of the reasons why he invaded Ukraine, in addition to his imperialistic ambitions to take over the sovereign country next door. And also, currently, the past 20 months were quite tumultuous and very challenging, because on one hand, Ukrainian policymakers have adopted a strategy of total democratic resilience, which means fending off the Russian attack on one side. On the other hand, is also continuing with its democratic reforms. For many Eastern European countries, as well as for Ukraine now, joining European Union is serving as an engine of those reforms. And last year in June, Ukraine was formally recognized as a candidate member for the European Union. And for Ukraine, we do believe that that's a very strong motivation, but also a mechanism how we can drive those economic, democratic reforms forward, including those of tackling corruption and dealing with other issues related to weak corporate governance, which needs to be strengthened, be it within the state-owned enterprises or within even democratic institutions. Something which kind of happened as an extra, I would say that as a derivative, but rather as a situation. For a long time, Ukraine, but as many other post-Soviet countries, we were seeing the problem of the oligarchs and the influence of those oligarchs. And this past 20 months, and actually I would say that since President Zelensky became a president, the role of those oligarchs has diminished in many different respects. Some just lost their assets because of the Russian invasion, some just lost their influence, and we generally see it in Ukraine as a positive trend, because often we saw some examples of some potential state capture or excessive influence with certain political groups which are organized around or organized by certain high net worth individuals, or oligarchs as we call them. They were a threat to a democracy, or could be a threat to democracy, or they were hampering the development that we needed. Also, I have to point out to a very important factor which is dominant in Ukraine, and it's related to our vibrant civil society. And I think civil society in Ukraine really plays a much bigger role than in many even developed countries, because they're not only serving as a watchdog of what's happening in Ukraine. Often, Ukrainian civil society and different organizations, they get much more involved on advocacy level, on even drafting legislation level, on even lobbying the right legislation, which is important to drive certain changes or certain reforms. And since 2014, since the Revolution of Dignity, we've seen an emergence of that very vibrant and strong civil society in Ukraine, which has kept the government accountable and added more transparency. And that also includes different investigative journalist groups of investigative journalists who are run by independent media, but also others. We've seen actually for the past 20 months, we've seen the increase of those NGOs in Ukraine has actually tripled from 150 to 450. But there are also many others, NGOs, which are now kind of working on humanitarian missions. Some are become kind of charities / NGOs who on one hand are crowdfunding for Ukraine's defense forces, but there are others who are making sure that Ukraine is moving in the right direction. Of course, doing all these reforms at the times when you have a big nuclear power, which is destroying your country, killing your people, destroying infrastructure, sending incessant missiles and swarm of drones at you, is not an easy one, right? Because there is an issue of national security, there is an issue of war, and there's also the issue of democracy in itself. Apparently, that in Ukraine, as it would be in any other country, the democratic freedoms are currently restricted or curtailed as stipulated by the Ukrainian constitution. And this is where we come to the question of the debates and debates about the elections. Should we do the elections? Should we not do the elections? The regular elections for the parliament were scheduled to be happening now, actually, in October. And according to our legislation and the martial law that we have, and according to the constitution, we just cannot organize these elections at this time. And generally, we have a consensus within Ukraine, though I've seen some other opposing views, but even generally, Ukraine's civil society and different other groups realize that holding elections at the times of war is not going to happen, because it's difficult to provide full freedom and access to free media, but also access to full democratic freedoms, just because of the threat that we are facing from Russia. As you know, Russia has been undermining Ukraine for a very long period of time, and they have really, they've been working hard on exploit Ukraine internally. And for that purpose, they used all the possible mechanisms of malign foreign influence that you can imagine, by sometimes directly funding certain political parties to blow up Ukraine from within, using the Russian Orthodox Church to undermine Ukrainian government and Ukrainian society, having their own media, which they used to run in Ukraine, to also create problems within the country. And this all has, really come up to our face when the invasion started. And the invasion started in 2014. I have to, keep the record straight. This is not something new. Russia has been waging this war for a long time. So I think it's a war against democracy. It's a war against human rights. It's a war against all the basic values and fundamental values which the free countries and all the free countries of the world share. And for us, it's important to maintain that resilience within the country to fight and resist this invasion, but also it's important to maintain the resilience of the coalition of countries which are supporting us. And that's, I'm extremely grateful to Australia for making their contribution to this. Australia being one of the 50 nations which are supporting us militarily. It's important that support is continued. And of course, that's been always not an easy one, right? And for us, every day this war drags on. We see more misery, more destruction, more death. In a way, it's now kind of escaped. It's not on the headlines anymore, but the war is real. It's happening at the moment. We see heinous Russian war crimes committed by the Russian troops, either by destroying civilian infrastructure, blowing up a dam which flooded big parts of Ukraine, or destroying our power generation, electricity distribution, or committing some atrocious war crimes to the people which are now currently under the Russian occupation. So we see it on the regular basis. We see it online every day. This war became kind of a Hollywood movie because you can watch it as a reality show. For us Ukrainians, it's extremely traumatizing. It's very traumatizing for everybody who is in Ukraine or who is outside of Ukraine, but who is Ukrainian. We have to watch it out there. What's important that we fully understand that we have to fight for democracy. And sometimes in developed societies, it's kind of difficult to explain why you should be fighting for democracy, because democracy is taken for granted. And I think now for Ukrainians that we have to go through this pain, through this experience, it's really what we are fighting for. And we are fighting for a better future for Ukraine, for a flourishing democratic country which would be part of the European Union.
and which would be part of the European family. It took this big invasion of Russia for Europe to realize that Ukraine must be accepted into that family of the European nations. Of course, there will be lots of, it's still a long road ahead, and definitely strengthening those democratic institutions within the countries, being able to implement the economic reforms, judicial reforms in the country will be crucial for making sure that we can follow that path.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador, for this comprehensive and informative answer to a very broad question. And I wanted to pick on a couple of themes that you mentioned there, and one of them is the importance of maintaining international unity and solidarity in addition to domestic resilience. And this is where I would like to come to Ben. Ben, you've been doing research on the way that domestic public opinion influences diplomatic efforts by nations, and I think we've seen a dramatic manifestation of that with some populist leaders' fickle adherence to international commitments and alliances, partly in response to the domestic pressures they're under. And I was wondering, what does your research tell us about the ability of democratic nations, both on their own but also in international alliances, to withstand those international threats that they have to confront?
Yeah, thanks, Anton. So I guess first I'll say that I as I was saying to the ambassador before we started, I actually wrote my PhD on Russian and Ukrainian foreign policy and spent a long time in the 90s in Kiev and Moscow as well. And I know the area well, and it really is one of the amazing things about Ukraine that there's this very strong civil society from a post-Soviet system where civil society was not a given and was not a part of the culture before the fall of the Soviet Union. So it's been heart-wrenching to watch this place that I know well, especially Kiev, be subject to this, to the invasion and war, but also pretty impressive to see the performance of Ukraine and the toughness and backbone of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people coming together. There was a paper written by my PhD supervisor asking whether Ukraine was a political community back in the 1990s using survey data. And he found even back then in the early post-Soviet period that there was a real sense of political identity among Ukrainians, including in the East, including the Russian speakers. And I think that, giving a plug to my old PhD supervisor, that really has come through. So and the gradual strengthening and development of Ukrainian democracy has been quite a success story. But I mean, getting more to your question, Anton, I mean, there are things that we know. I've spent most of my research is on international conflict, so international war and peace. And there are things that we know really well in social science and political science about democracy and political violence. And one of them is called the democratic peace. This is a line of research. It's one of the biggest lines of research in political science and social science, going on from the 90s onwards, with hundreds of studies showing that democracies do not go to war with each other internationally. It's extremely rare. And there are theories about why this happens, mainly focusing on the institutions of democratic governance, accountability, and leaders' knowledge that they will pay for foreign policy mistakes and the costs of war imposed on the population. And this is, Koski and I, a leading political scientist at Harvard, has published a paper recently saying that this is a correlation. The evidence is not causal because we can't do experiments with real-world international relations, but in terms of correlations that exist in the world out there, this is a bit stronger than the correlation between smoking and cancer. So I think we really do know that democracy has some real positive effects on war and peace, and we also know there's a parallel and also very strong literature on what's called the domestic democratic peace, that democratic societies even ones that are, not fully democratic, transitional, tend to be more peaceful and have less violence. There's a bit more debate about this, but the literature is very strong that full, stable democracies are not really prone to serious domestic political violence, and especially civil war in the way that less democratic countries are. So I think getting back to sort of the ambassador's comments about it, taking democracy for granted, I think it's easy. I grew up in the U.S. and have spent 20 years in Australia. It's easy to take for granted the benefits that we enjoy from our political systems, as frustrating as they are. And Stan Grant's talk last night very much expressed deep frustration with democracy, and I'm from the U.S. I could say a lot about my frustrations with U.S. democracy. But I think it's important not to take these benefits for granted, and especially in comparative perspective, just basic peace, the lack of extreme organized violence that we just don't experience in our societies. So those are things that we sort of know, and I've contributed a bit to that literature, but it's a big, broad literature that's pretty solid. We also know, in getting more to my research, that there is something called soft power. I've studied international public opinion about the United States and how this is formed, and whether it matters in international affairs. And this soft power is an idea developed by Joseph Nye, also at Harvard. But something that I've taken on in my research for about 20 years now. And we do know, I think, based on my studies, but not only my studies, that states can influence how they are perceived, and the United States in particular can influence how it's perceived through public diplomacy activities. And President Zelensky is a great example of this, I think, appearing time and time again through video and in person to try to influence international public opinion for support. And I think this is a really important part of the story of international support for Ukraine, but also through things like health diplomacy, as it's sometimes called. I've studied this massive aid program called PEPFAR that sort of surprisingly George W. Bush in the U.S. instituted that gave a huge amount of medical support for AIDS, the AIDS crisis. And we've found, my co-author Yusako Hariuchi and I have found strong causal evidence that this really improves the U.S. image around the world. But we've also found that in other studies that international opinion about the United States then affects how countries behave in their real hard power foreign policies towards the United States. And in one study we did, and sort of the clearest example I think of this is the Iraq War, which was not a popular war around the world and not a popular war with US allies, France and Germany, for a lot of very good reasons. But we found that where the US had a better public image and there's more favorability towards the United States, countries were more likely to send troops when requested and pressured by the United States. And it makes sense. Our theory is that for issues that are salient to the public, and sending troops abroad is almost always important for regular voters, governments respond to public opinion. And if there's not much resistance to cooperating with the United States, you're more likely to get those troops sent to Iraq. And so, I think most of us have disagreements with the Iraq War, many of us, but we found that this, in a real-world political sense, this really mattered to which countries sent troops, including Australia, where the U.S. is among the most popular. It's not, sort of unequivocally popular, unexceptionally popular, but it's comparatively among the most popular. So coming to my more recent research and talking about the value of democracy, what I'm really interested in now is whether people in in countries around the world, and especially democracies, people value democracy as a foreign policy objective or an element in international relations. So I'm thinking about countries like Ukraine. Very much this is a struggle for democracy, a budding, emerging democracy that's under threat of being quashed by a clearly autocratic system. But Taiwan and other countries around the world that are struggling or under potential threat from large non-democracies. And so we've done a study of 9 important U.S. partners around the world doing survey experiments. So this where you do surveys in different countries and you randomize the treatment of people reading some information or not reading that information or having different forms of information. So we're first study we're interested in whether U.S. democratic backsliding reduces people's support for cooperation with the United States. Do they care that the United States is a democracy, or does that not really affect their foreign policy preferences? And we find that across these 9, major U.S. partners like Germany, France, UK, Australia, New Zealand, we find that it does affect the U.S. image. It degrades the U.S. image. And then one of the criticisms we got, or one of the issues with the study, is that, well, that's fine, it degrades the U.S. image, but does that have an impact on people's foreign policy views? So we did a follow-up study in New Zealand and asked particularly about AUKUS. And New Zealand is under some U.S. pressure, but also having this discussion about whether to join the AUKUS agreement that Australia, UK, and U.S. have, not to get nuclear submarines, but to get a lot of other high-tech military support. And we found that the respondents who got the information about U.S. democratic backsliding were less likely to support New Zealand joining AUKUS. So to me, although it's sort of disheartening maybe for the U.S., to me this is sort of encouraging that people actually care about the democratic nature of their allies, and they're important allies, even a major, very powerful country like the United States. Another study we did was in Japan, where we looked at. Okay, so I'll wrap up. Yeah, looked at we gave people information about Russian election interference in the U.S. election, and had a story of this degrading U.S. democracy. And in Japan, we found that people were more concerned about U.S. looking weak or not necessarily being capable enough to defend it, and that's how they lost faith in the U.S. alliance. But the U.S. as a democracy had less of an impact, and that makes sense given the degree of threat Japan is under. But I'll stop there and look forward to the other panelists. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Ben. And one of the things you mentioned is that, of course, those of us based in Australia are lucky to be in a place without, as you put it, extreme organized violence. That doesn't mean that there's no organized violence at all, to a much lesser extent. And this, I think, is where Danielle's expertise in particular comes in. So I wanted to ask you about serious and organized crime threats that affect Australia. It can be presumably quite diverse, from human trafficking, arms trade, drug trafficking, to more sophisticated forms of financial crime, but still accompanied with significant violence. And that poses a different challenge to our democracy, in the sense of presenting us with different trade-offs between being tough on crime, being effective in suppressing crime, but also safeguarding civil liberties, making sure that the government does not intervene too much in the lives of the law-abiding mass of the population. So do you think there are any particular areas where that tension is especially acute in Australia or globally?
Absolutely. Thank you, Anton. I think I'll make 4 points and then see if I can get them out in the 10 minutes. The first is probably stating the obvious, but transnational crime has consequences both for national security and for human security, and that's for a number of reasons, including unregulated labour markets and the implications that has for human rights, particularly in the context of modern slavery, undermining legitimate economies, increasing public spending for security and policing, putting up insurance premiums, and a whole bunch of economic, social, cultural and political elements. And the other point to note, of course, is that if you're a sensible transnational criminal, you diversify your portfolio. So these crimes that you mentioned, serious organised crimes such as, for example, money laundering, trafficking in persons, wildlife trafficking, weapons smuggling and so on and so forth, they don't occur in isolation from one another. And so where you have, for example, unregulated labour markets, such as through modern slavery, which does occur in Australia, you're actually helping support inadvertently other types of serious organised crimes, such as terrorism organising or terrorism financing. So they're not discrete crimes, they're interconnected. I just want to make that point about the economy. To put it in some context, in 2009, transnational crime generated $870 billion. And that was equivalent in that year to 6 times the amount of official development assistance in that year. So it's actually making more money than what we're giving aid, and it has destabilising effects on democracy, both globally and regionally, and of course that has consequences for Australia, even though at face value we might be seen to be relatively doing okay. A 2020-21 report estimated the cost of serious organised crime in Australia at $60.1 billion, and that included a whole bunch of factors, including medical costs, policing costs, so on and so forth. But it does actually have a serious economic impact and flow-on consequences for human rights. And so, Anton, you've asked specifically about some of the trade-offs. And of course, again, I'm stating the obvious that there is always a tension between national security imperatives and civil liberties. It's not always an irreconcilable tension, but it's a tension that already exists. And generally, we have a relatively stable rule of law culture, generally stable institutions, including at the judicial level. But I'll draw on Joe Ford's point this morning. It's those micro incursions that actually make us less resilient to a crisis when it comes along. And that is eroding the capacity of the courts to review actions of the executive, little bit by little bit by little bit, to the point where communities can feel isolated or picked on, and that has consequences for social cohesion. So I think we've seen this play out in the whistleblowing cases that have been quite public. Is this actually where the public is happy having its resources spent in the pursuing of actually what turned out to be quite legitimate whistleblowing? And it also goes, of course, to public trust and legitimacy. So I think there's two, to give you an example of this, 2 areas where these tensions can play out. A colleague of mine, Jake Blight, he'll be the incoming independent monitor of national security legislation coming in. Before he was appointed to that, he wrote an article which had a look at ASIO's telephone interception service warrants. Now, that law was actually set up in 1960 and hasn't been significantly revised since. Now, I'm sure I don't need to tell you that the data ASIO could get when they tapped a phone in 1960 was quite significantly less than what ASIO can get if they look at your phone today, in terms of what exists on our phone and our personal lives. Now, that may seem a small thing, and often the rhetoric is, well, you know, I've got nothing to hide, so why does it matter? But there are important reasons why institutions should take account of privacy rights and should be bound by proportionate mechanisms in undertaking national security operations. It affects recruitment to the national security sector itself, if there is a lack of trust from the community in those institutions. It also affects flows of information. Another example, I think, is, and you'd be more familiar with this than me, Anton, given your work, but financial surveillance warrants in 2020, I think 2021, there was legislation that created a whole bunch of new warrants. So data disruption, network activity warrants, account takeover warrants, which is, you know, obviously really helpful for following the money, because you have to follow the money in transnational organised crime. That's the whole point. It's all interconnected. It's a microeconomy in and of itself. But I'm very interested to watch those. There is oversight from the Ombudsperson and oversight from IGES, the Independent Inspector General of Intelligence and Security. But generally, if you ask anyone from those sectors, they're quite under-resourced in terms of staff and capacity to look at complaints, in contrast to the size of the national security community, for example, and the law enforcement. And of course, the NAC will help, the new Anti-Corruption Commission, but there are significant national security carve-outs in that legislation, of course. There is a five-year sunset clause with that legislation. But all of that is to make the point that we do have to allow a long leash for national security and human security initiatives, and I think we'd all accept that. But there are really important reasons. You made the point about not taking democracy for granted. All these sort of dry technical institutional limitations are really, really important for public confidence and for the strength of public institutions, particularly in a country where we don't have a constitutional Bill of Rights. So there are no overarching reasons for a court to be able to strike down legislation that doesn't guarantee fair trial rights or doesn't guarantee due process or allows for long-term detention of children, for example. And often this legislation will have bipartisan support because no political party wants to be the party that's soft on national security. So there's often a minimal public debate on these issues, which is, why I say the importance of protection for whistleblowers is so important. There is a Public Interest Disclosure Act at the federal level, but again, there are lots of national security carve-outs of that legislation in terms of legitimate and genuine whistleblowing. Again, the NAC will probably help a lot with that. The third point I wanted to make is just one of context. And so, again, we do relatively well, globally speaking, in Australia. But to give you another example of how we can inadvertently be involved in serious organised crime and human rights violations is in the renewable energy sector, for example. A lot of the materials that we need for that sector actually come from places where the labour standards are not being protected and where serious organised international crime is loosely involved in those areas. And so, for example, New South Wales has introduced a consumer code of conduct that says, hey, maybe check where your raw materials are coming from when you're producing renewable energy, but I think we need more overarching things. Otherwise, inadvertently, we are contributing to that economy, which in turn has destabilising effects for national and human security. The other point I want to make is that with an increase in climate emergency triggered natural disasters, we're going to see inevitably around the globe a decreased ability of the state to provide goods and services to its people during times of natural disaster. It's just inevitable, and that creates a real risk factor for serious organised crime to take up and fill that gap. You can look in other parts of the world where there's a genuine battle for hearts and minds in organised crime in terms of giving the people what we need. We saw that play out in Italy during COVID, for example. So climate is actually, believe it or not, it seems an indirect link, but the increase in natural disasters and the global mobilisation, or mobilisation with dignity, as we're now talking about it in the Blue Pacific, is going to create opportunities for serious crime, and we need to be cognizant of that. The other point I'll just make, the fourth point I'll make, is that when I talk to counter-terrorism experts, they'll often say that there's no incident of terrorism, and terrorism is a type of organised crime in some instances. There's no instance of that without an element of injustice and shame, but there's always a tipping point where someone who's experienced injustice or shame is able to be recruited, for example, by a thought leader. And in terms of where that tipping point lies, I think Australia, we're doing pretty well, but we need to be very careful about increasing levels of inequality and injustice in our communities, both as a result of increased climate emergencies, for example, and housing crisis. It's all sort of connected in that sense. The other point I'll make is that there are genuine legal things you can do to protect around these things, such as requiring public interest and proportionality requirements in national security legislation that seeks to address a legitimate concern, but at the same time still wanting to protect our democracy and the important institutional integrity that comes with that. And also, when used effectively, extraterritorial jurisdiction, so jurisdiction that allows the state to regulate cross-border challenges, can be very effective as long as the right safeguard mechanisms are in place. And also, just to make the point again, going back to the anti-terror experts now and the rise of the extreme right in Australia, I've read stuff that sort of talks about it being more serious a threat in Australia than anything Al-Qaeda inspired ever was. And so in terms of keeping an eye on disinformation and, again, that social cohesion, social equality stuff, and that existence of injustice and shame on the one hand, and needing solid democratic institutions on the other. And I'll leave it at that and look forward to hearing what my colleague has to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle. So clearly a number of challenges there for Australia as well, privileged though it is in a number of ways. Now, Suzanne, we've talked a bit about a broad array of different discrete issues around democracy and violence, and I wanted now to zoom out a bit and talk about that concept of democratic backsliding that we often hear about on the media. And I was wondering, based on your research, is that a thing? Are we genuinely experiencing democratic backsliding globally? And if it is in fact the case, then are there any broad general trends that can be discerned, or is each unhappy country unhappy democracy-wise in its own way? Yeah, and I suppose another thing where it would be really interesting to hear your views is the role of corporations in that, given your work in that field as well.
Okay, thank you very much. And I was very interested in what the other panellists had to say, because there's so many commonalities with what I'm saying as well, and the intersection of us across different disciplines is quite interesting. So in terms of backsliding, we talk about it a lot, you know, in democracies backslidings occur. But what does it actually mean? And so there's three different types of backsliding that can occur. And first that we usually see is the reductions around freedoms of expression and free media. And that tends to be the first thing, that's the easiest thing to be challenged in reducing democratic principles. The second one is the reduction of voting opportunities and voter turnout. And the third one is a reduction in the parliament and judiciary separation. And we see in democratic liberal democracies that there are examples of these occurring all the time. You know, in the US, in Hong Kong, Ukraine, Philippines, India, you know, in Australia as well. And so there's not a one model of democratic backsliding, but it's a trajectory or some sort of continuum of where these things are occurring. So even in democratic countries, we see backsliding occurring, and then that's before we get to examples of war and violence and authoritarian regimes. And so there's mapping that can be done of what's happening in a lot of countries. But for me, even the step before that, before thinking about violence, is really what's struck me over the last couple of years is the anger. And for me, anger is a form of violence. And I was struck by it at the Voice referendum. I was a volunteer on the Yes campaign. And the anger that people felt. I don't want to maybe put a gender lens on it, but it tended to come from men. So will put a gender lens on it. And all age groups. And so that struck me as, you know, quite difficult to deal with. But I live in Victoria, and over the time of COVID, there's been anger. There's a lot of anger. And so, you know, Saturday mornings you go down into the Melbourne CBD and there's demonstrations. Now, we you know, all believe in freedom of expression, but these people are so angry, and whatever day you go down there, there's a demonstration. They've been demonstrating against vaccinations, against COVID. There's a conspiracy about COVID. There's people, you know, talking about being sovereign citizens and freedom of rights and carrying flags. There's neo-Nazis on the steps of Parliament. There's anti-trans, there's people talking about demonstrating at libraries because there's trans people reading books to children. There's anger with people with different opinions. There's anger at the moment over sporting clubs and the AFL talking about the voice. There's anti-environment demonstrations, there's freedom marches, there's Let Women Speak along marching with neo-Nazis. And this is something that sort of occurred over the last few years. And to me, it's a real shock that when you walk along the street, you're seeing this anger. And violence, I think, is really an undercurrent in this. So I think that people are not really listening to opposing voices, they're surrounding themselves with others who are like-minded. And people are living in communities that reflect their own opinions. And they're sort of surrounding themselves with tribal thinking, and they feel threatened by people that are different to them. And I don't mean they look different, but different opinions, an inability to really communicate. People are lacking trust in government and in media. And I wondered sort of where this is coming from. And when I look at, say, our education system, you know, the public versus the private education system, people are in tribes, they don't mix across different school groups, in different class groups. We see blue versus white collar, regional versus city, elites, religions, all these tribes that people are feeling more comfortable with. So why is this occurring is what's worrying me. And I think that really brings together a lot of things that we've been talking about over the last 2 days. Now, democratic institutions are key. They're strong in Australia. You've spoken a lot about it. People have spoken about the legal institutions. But again, our society is really being misinformed, and we're at risk because of that misinformation and this lack of empathy between the different groups. Now, we do have other institutions that I think are stepping into, you know, some of these gaps. And we see the role of corporations, for example, who have been really strong at the voice, for example. We see social advocacy groups, unions, sporting organisations, legal experts all coming out and supporting the voice. But still the voice went down. And what worried me at that whole time was also that the AFL in Victoria, for example, came out really strongly in support of the voice. But as we got closer to the referendum, they seemed to me to be backing off. And they didn't talk about it so much at the time of the grand final, and they sort of lowered their voice in talking positively about the voice because of this sort of tribalism or sort of pushback around being woke. And some of the corporations were also starting to really lower their voice. So even though I was positive that they were standing up, there was still, to me, I was disappointed in their really backing off. So the corporations, the unions, the NGOs have a big role to play in maintaining our democracy. And I was really chuffed this week when I was actually watched online on Twitter the annual general meeting of Wesfarmers Group. And they were criticised by some of the shareholders because they had donated $2 million to the Yes campaign. And there's some shareholders who actually criticised them. They criticised the role of directors. They questioned why that donation was made. And they asked the directors to refund the donation out of their own private funds. Why the Wesfarmers Group was supporting a social cause that they felt wasn't warranted and using company money. And I was really pleased that the chairman actually got up and talked really positively about the voice and saying that they wouldn't back down and that they employ 4,000 Indigenous Australians and they can contribute to the community of over $75 million a year. And there has been no points raised by shareholders about any of the contributions in the past that they've made. So why would they start? What was the problem with donating to the Voice campaign along with all the other community connections? And so for me, when I watched that video of that chairperson, I thought that is great leadership. That is great leadership that they are willing to be standing up and being counted. And we need more of our institutions to be able to do that, to be able to say, we support these movements and that it's legitimate for us to be able to be involved in these movements to counteract that countervailing force of violence, you know, and demonstrations on the street. And I found with the Voice Yes campaign that there really was a grassroots movement in that. So I think democracy remains a force for peace, but we need to provide bridges for these different groups to understand each other. And it is costly to preserve democracy, and as we're in an environment where we're going through cost of living, climate change, people are feeling threatened by all of these changes, there's terrorism, it's an environment for some of this fear to continue to grow, where the other is always at fault. We blame the other for our own circumstances, whether it moves into a warlike situation or not. There's a continuum of people being angry as we move away from what I would call a peaceful existence. People are looking for certainty to be told that they are okay, that the institutions that we've grown up with can protect them and maintain the status quo. And this is where populism comes in. So I won't talk a lot about other things I was going to yet, but I just wanted to conclude with this quote that Barry Jones wrote in the Saturday paper at the weekend. He said that liberal democracy depends on rational debate, where evidence is testable. Both sides use a common language and accept accountability for misleading. If democracy is to survive, it will require each of us to commit to hard knowledge, rational calculation, basic values, and an obstinate will to end avoidable suffering. The question I'm left with is, are we up to it? And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for that. An excellent set of sort of broader reflective conclusions there, which I think is a fitting end to those remarks. We've got around 10 minutes for Q&A with the audience and quite a lot of topics to choose from on our menu. So anyone who would like to jump in, please do grab the mic. And if you wouldn't mind just briefly introducing yourself.
Hi, I'm Chris Farnham from the Department of Home Affairs, specifically from the Strengthening Democracy Task Force. So I have obviously a very close interest in everything that we're discussing here today. Given the intimacy of the discussion, I might actually have two questions if possible. The first one is to Professor Young. In your closing there, you were talking about having people understand each other to help take some of the heat out of the discussion. However, and when you're even talking about some of these people that are protesting in Melbourne, we're talking about sovereign citizens, exclusive nationalists, and people like the QAnon crowd and so on, who are specifically aiming at destroying the political systems and the society that we have. So where do we draw the line from wanting to understand people's point of views to actually pushing back and combating some of these very destructive and toxic elements that are moving into the public debate? And also a very quick question for Professor Goldsmith is you talked about the domestic democratic peace theory and how the theory is that democracy reduces the amount of likelihood for violence in more advanced democracies. I'm just wondering if you have a comment, which I think you might, on the trajectory that the US is such a highly advanced democracy, how we are starting to see more violence and more anger domestically within that society, and what you think the trajectory in the US looks like.
Thank you for that. Let's go to Susanna first and then Ben.
I think you're right, and there's tensions in that, isn't there? There's tensions between, free speech and allowing that to occur, and then when it's gone too far. And so I was really struck the last couple of weeks with, local councils, for example, cancelling face-to-face meetings because of these people getting up and complaining about trans people reading at the libraries, which is, parents take their children there. They want the children to be read to. What's the problem with that? But councils went as far as cancelling their meetings because of this aggression. So I think that you have to stand up to that you have to bring security forces to stop the aggression and allow the council meeting to continue and allow those reading activities to continue, because otherwise you're just backing down. So yes, you've got to have consultation between the groups, but you have to use our existing structures to make sure that peace is maintained and that people are allowed to actually carry out their day-to-day activities. Does that answer? Yeah.
Ben, did you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the question. So in the sort of political science studies of domestic democratic peace, one of the things that's focused on is the ability of the different actors to make credible commitments to each other that help them avoid a violent conflict. So sort of an optimistic way to think about the United States is that people, scholars like Barbara Walter, for example, in the US, talking about the US, looking like many societies, she's an expert in civil war, that are on the verge of civil war. and she's given some, I don't know if she's given a sort of a probability, but a sense that there's a high chance that the U.S. will actually experience civil war in the near future. The way that I might think about it is that, yes, the U.S. has a lot of these indicators, those of us who study political violence around the world comparatively, that it could be in real danger of mass killings or civil war, other real atrocities or serious organized violence. But it is the democratic institutions would help it avoid those situations. So the idea that you still have the system that seems like it's going to allow an alteration of power and reasonably free and fair elections, where the people on the side who feel like they, on both sides, where they feel like they have a lot to lose, and it's almost an existential battle between the Republicans and Democrats, can nevertheless, if they lose an election, can think about the credible commitment of the other side to contest the next election. And so that's sort of, I won't take up too much time, but that's the essence of the theory. The U.S. is at risk. It seems at risk, but what we understand about democracies is that even with the palpable possibility of violence and violence actually happening in the January 6th insurrection, we can have some confidence it won't escalate.
Thank you. I think we've got time for another 2 questions or so.
Thank you. Mark Booth from Nous Group. Thank you for the panel. It's been a fabulous conversation. Just the opposite side of the previous question, I guess. In the first presentation this morning, there was comments about apathy, and apathy is the enemy of democracy. I guess just a thought about when this kind of becomes normalised. And there's examples around The Voice, it became, it's all too hard, it's too difficult, let's not bother, let's just vote no. And the Ukrainian ambassador saying increasing efforts to keep dashing around to try and keep this at the forefront of people's minds, so it doesn't go into that kind of apathy. And just any comments on that apathy as a problem?
Thank you. Danielle, would you like to start?
Sort of wanted to add a provocation to that, if that's okay. And I was listening to the other question, just on a personal level. I'm from the far northern rivers, and it's actually extraordinary to me the way the far right and the sovereign citizens have captured the children of the flower children, essentially through the anti-vax movement. That's essentially how it's happened. There are now sovereign citizens in hippie towns. It's wild. These are people I grew up with. They're not out there nasty people. They're people who genuinely think The Voice was a corporation that was going to sell Australia to the UN. It really blows my mind. And just to pick up that apathy point, and I guess a provocation to the panel is, I teach a subject called climate, environment and security, and I had an ex-military speaker who's interested in climate and the military and what that does to a military when it's constantly having to deal with climate crisis. And she said that we have this shopping list of what democracy looks like, but we tend to only leverage certain elements of the shopping list. And actually, capitalism and individualism does very well under democracy, and we don't necessarily always have the toolkit in how we think about democracy to leverage things like empathy and collectivism in terms of responding to those very individualistic, apathetic type, semi-violent extremes. And I'm just interested as to what toolkits democracy has left to fight those when actually individualism does so well under that framework.
Well, I think given that it's a provocation,
so I've answered that. Yeah, there's a provocation.
We should ask the diplomat to deal with the provocation. But maybe any broader reflections on apathy and how you deal with that problem of apathy in your daily work as you try to bring the events in Ukraine continuously to the attention of the world.
Just briefly, I wanted to also reflect on one of the examples that was used here before I answered that question, on how democracies are often vulnerable to external influence, and I think that example about this people who live out there, kind of been created by anti-vaxxing movement. We've seen a lot of the Russian involvement, but also Chinese involvement in sort of supporting different groups and amplifying their voice through social media, because this is a very, this is what is, because once you can convince or you can undermine trust towards the government, you can undermine trust towards conventional media, this audience becomes very susceptible to any kind of external influence, believing conspiracy theories, would be very, and then could be used for disrupting the country. Be it they can do whatever, right? They can go on the government, right? Because they become living in their own world, and this is where authoritarian regimes have seen a weakness within the democracies, and this is where they have, has specifically put resources into polarizing societies, but also into weakening democracies and weakening democratic institutions by funding similar things. And now it's become much easier than it was in the old day, because I think it was internet is ubiquitous, pretty much accessible to everybody. It's kind of cheap to create anything totally fake, but would be very compelling and emotional, and just spread it out there, and that can cause a disruption within the society. And I'll just show you one of the examples of how disinformation, I know you have a whole panel after this where you'll be talking about disinformation and propaganda as a threat to democracy. But there was one example in 2015 when Russians have organized a special operation to undermine Germany. And that was a case about a girl which allegedly was raped by a Syrian refugee in Germany. And that became news on the Russian television. And all of a sudden it was picked up by German media, and nobody has actually checked the story, because the story was totally made up, and it was created by Russian military, whatever, intelligence, whoever have done it. But the thing is that the reaction was so strong. There was a huge demonstration in front of the Chancellor's house, and they were really taking down the government, demanding that. And you remember that was a time when over 1 million refugees from Syria came to Germany. It was really a huge disruption to the security within Germany. And this is just one example of how you can do one story, one special operation, and you can really possess threat to Ukraine. But coming back to a question in terms of apathy, what's important is something, I don't know, I don't have a solution for that, because in a way, I remember when, for instance, when the civil war in Syria started, I used to voraciously read all about the news in Syria, what's happening there, but then 6 months later, you kind of plug out of it, right? It's just too much. How many stories can you read about violence? How many stories can you read about war crimes? There is, for a human psychologist, there is a limit to how much you can take it. So for us, Ukraine is an existential war. We have to keep on fighting. But again, for us to maintain focus is difficult, because it just, for the world, it's difficult to follow it. Also, it becomes new normal. It's no longer news. And, there is another missile killing more people in Ukraine. There are more swarm drones. Now, of course, the events in the Middle East, it's top news right now. But these are also similar stories, because we talk about violence, war, and everything. And I think for well-functioning countries, it's too far away for many countries, too distant. It's difficult to relate unless you have somebody who's in that. And it's difficult to maintain that focus. And this is actually the bat of the authoritarian regimes. This is what Russia is betting on, for that fatigue to settle in, for that apathy to come, for democracies being busy with their own, elections, let's put it this way, as we are seeing elections in the US, and we all understand what can happen and what threat it is for Ukraine in terms of, having US as a leader of the coalition of countries supporting Ukraine. And it's becoming very dangerous, of course. And what if Russia what if Russia wins? What are the repercussions here in the Indo-Pacific? What are the implications for democracy? Because that will be a huge victory for authoritarian regimes. And say, oh, look, we can, we did it. You can do it again. You can do it in your part of the world, and that's a dangerous and very slippery slope we are walking.
Thank you, Ben. Very quickly.
Yeah, just sort of an extra comment about apathy. As someone who spends a lot of time studying public opinion, I think thinking about apathy is not exactly the right way to think about it, because people have a list of things they care about or priorities. I think it's thinking about what things people really care about. People, study public opinion. It's the economy. It's your basic security, your day-to-day needs for regular people. So one thing I think is extremely important in advanced democracies is education, and teaching people to discern between good information, logical, information that makes sense and has a basis, and that doesn't. People who are demonstrating based on false information or on the steps of parliament doing Nazi salutes and all that are not apathetic. They just really care about things that don't seem to make sense to many of us. So I'd sort of reconfigure it about, providing that strong basis for judgment for regular people. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. That was a fascinating discussion and an excellent segue to the next session on disinformation. So thank you very much to all who attended or watched online, and please join me in thanking our panel.